I'm Andrew Susskind, and I'm a psychotherapist and author based on the west side of Los Angeles since 1992, specializing in trauma and addictive compulsive behaviors. Welcome to my podcast, named after my recent book and workbook, It's Not About the Sex. Here we have direct and honest conversations related to compulsive sexual behavior and trauma, all from a sexual health perspective. Our intention is to offer fresh viewpoints and practical strategies toward establishing greater intimacy and a more deeply connected life. Let's begin. Chapter 4, Moving Beyond Narcissism. I used to think the world revolved around me. As the golden child of the family, it always seemed like I would get my way no matter what. Maybe this was an early version of healthy entitlement, the belief that if I wanted it enough, it would eventually come to me. Or maybe it was my make-believe bubble that I could always get what I want if I whined long enough to get it. Yet, I realized early on that I had been born into a troubled family and held on to the belief that my narcissistic wall would protect me from the unpredictable storms that inevitably came my way in my family. Somehow, I held on to the fantasy that my family was functional, but it became clear that this was just an illusion. Although she tries to raise 4 boys, my mother's capacity to keep up with all her roles and responsibilities was rather limited. Don't get me wrong, my mom did the best she knew how with a strong veneer of narcissism that left me longing for some kind of meaningful contact. Maybe she modeled for me how narcissism can be a way of regulating the distance from others in order to keep people at a safe distance. Nowadays, it seems that a narcissistic personality is often seen as some kind of plague. But let's face it, we all have a narcissistic layer within us. I believe my narcissism has given me the courage and the ambition to stretch beyond my so-called comfort zone and move toward a bigger life. In contrast to my mother and several others in my family, I've chosen a profession where I get to practice empathy skills and attunement. Although I've had these skills from early on, developing empathy with all humans and animals is one of the antidotes to narcissism. Whenever a client puts their trust in me, it feels like a sacred agreement as I devote my calling to healing, growing, and deepening, both in my clients and in myself. Now I get to break the family legacy.
Andrew's reading that from his book, and that is chapter
4.
4. Okay, we're at chapter 4 for our listeners. Hopefully they're reading along with you. But so as you read that, I think we can all relate to it. I think of narcissism kind of as a spectrum type of, there's clinical probably if you're diagnosed on one end, and then feel like we all are kind of on there somewhere. But so what is the healthier side of narcissism that you speak of?
Well, the reason I wanted to focus on the healthier side of narcissism in my workbook is because it doesn't always get talked about this way. A lot of pop psychology nowadays and a lot of folks really talk about narcissists like there's something malignant, there's something wrong with them, there's something mean, etc. And I just want to go back to the very beginning for just a second, because when we're born, as babies, we want to see the gleam in the eye of our caregivers, usually our parents. And sometimes we get the gleam, sometimes we don't, sometimes it's intermittent. But generally speaking, there's a gap between what the baby really, really wants and what the baby gets. Now, if we break that down even further, we're really talking about a child feeling seen, feeling heard, feeling understood, feeling valued, and feeling respected for who they are as a human being, right? And so again, these are ideal ingredients, but
Right.
in actuality, there's always gaps, right? Sometimes more, sometimes less. And the reason I mention all of that is because from the beginning, we come into the world thinking that we've arrived, right?
Right. This is,
The
yeah,
the world
yeah.
revolves around
This is
us.
us. Yeah.
Right. We're going to be fed at the right time. We're going to be changed at the right time. We're
How
going to
dare
be
they?
right, right, exactly. How dare they? And so narcissism is part of being human.
Sure.
And there's less healthy narcissism and there's healthier narcissism. And I'm a big believer that it's not helpful to categorize or to name call
Hmm.
or to pathologize in in the usual ways that get thrown around, right? I
Yeah.
think it's a little bit of a time when it's not helpful really to do that, right?
Sort of like a armchair psychologist, like the society all of a sudden learns terms and applies them
Right,
as
right.
will. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So in essence, what I'm wanting to summarize is that narcissism is a part of who we are.
Hmm.
It's actually a survival strategy. It's a way of navigating the complicated ways of life and of relationships that we face. But when narcissism gets to be more extreme, sometimes it takes on the look of addictive compulsive tendencies, right? Somebody who's in what I call the bubble of an addiction or the bubble of a compulsion is by nature narcissistic, right? They're super self-centered.
Hmm.
There's nothing else other than how can I get my next fix, whatever that might be,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So I always say that beneath narcissism is actually brokenheartedness, right? Beneath narcissism is brokenheartedness. And I like to start from that place because I really don't want to make assumptions. I want to be curious. I don't want to judge. I want to stay open to what is really going on underneath this narcissistic veneer.
Mm, interesting. So, what is other-centeredness?
I know it's a big word. Other-centeredness.
I'm trying to
I
break it down. I'm thinking like centeredness, other-centeredness.
Right, right. Well, I can't take credit for this. I think I heard it at a 12-step meeting a long, long time ago, where somebody said, that if we're in the addictive compulsive bubble, we're super self-centered. Like there's just nothing else out there. And one of the antidotes to narcissism, one of the antidotes to self-centeredness is starting to look outside oneself,
Hmm.
right? Like we've talked about many times, different types of connection, right? Connection maybe to something spiritual within ourselves, something that is meaningful with emotionally reliable people in our life, something that may have a power greater than ourselves, whether we call that a higher power or universal energy or whatever it might be. But the idea of other-centeredness is really starting to look outside, right? So usually other-centeredness starts to take shape once the addictive compulsive tendencies diminish,
Hmm.
right? It's very difficult to start looking outward until that bubble is broken, basically.
Yeah. That's interesting because I do see that in clients in recovery who they're working on themselves. And we talked about this chapter a couple weeks ago, um, about this period of time in their life right now. They're so focused on themselves. And some of them are trying to have relationships, but it's really difficult to give to others when they're still so inwardly healing and working on themselves. So there's a certain time, I think, that this can happen, like you say, after it's diminished a little bit.
I agree. I think there is a window of opportunity that happens when there's that moment of, oh, there is a world out there, or there are people out there that I'm interested in getting to know. But you're right. I think it takes a certain foundation and sometimes a certain courage to start to venture out of that self-centered bubble. I do believe that we're all born with a generosity of spirit, that inside of all of us, that I don't think any baby comes into the world really, out to be self-centered. I don't think that's, that's a long-term goal for any child.
They're not born Olympians.
Exactly. But it's complicated, right? Because it's okay to focus on oneself, especially when we're talking about healing and recovery. But it's also so essential to start to create safe enough contacts out there, safe enough experiences. And I think about reclaiming one's generosity of spirit, right?
Mm.
And that somehow along the way, there's the brokenheartedness, there's trauma, there's all kinds of addictive compulsive strategies to try and feel better. But really underneath of that is that original generosity of spirit, which sometimes was lost at a very, very, very young age, like pre-verbal.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, do you think you can awaken that generosity?
I think we do as counselors, as therapists, as sponsors, as interventionists. I think the idea of awakening generosity it's almost like the generosity has been dormant, right? It's been on a shelf. And for whatever reason, it hasn't felt safe enough to even bring that part of oneself into the world, right? So the awakening can come in a lot of different ways, but I'll just mention a few possibilities. So self-compassion, as we've talked about many times, as well as compassion, is really a starting place. Can I put myself in someone else's shoes,
Mhm.
right? That's a hallmark of empathy, right? Which is a hallmark of narcissistic healing, if we want to call it that. And so compassion is really having that sense of, what is it like for that other person, right? Do I have to focus on myself too much or in a way that's not going to make room for the other person's experience? So that feels for me like the starting place is just acknowledging that how can I be compassionate with my own healing and recovery, but how can I be really compassionate with those around me, whether it be family or friends or colleagues or whoever that might be, right?
Mhm.
Um, as you and I have talked about before, I also believe that pets are a wonderful vehicle for awakening generosity. I mean, wouldn't you say with Lola, with your dog and with Bowie that we have this experience all the time where we get to choose, am I going to be emotionally generous or am I going to be stingy?
Mhm.
Right? Does that feel right to
It
you?
does feel right. Yeah, that's interesting to put it that way, but so true. I mean, that unconditional love they're always giving us.
Exactly. And I believe that we forget that when we take care of something, it might be a plant, it might be a dog, it could be anything that once we're outwardly focused, we're awakening generosity, right? So the same thing goes, I was talking with somebody the other day, a client was telling me about how gardening has become such a focal point of their recovery. And I said, what is it about the garden? And he says, I make things grow. I it's literally fertile ground for me to put seeds in the ground or these little saplings or whatever they're called, and to see them grow into something beautiful and rich and sometimes food there that
Right.
becomes nourishment. So keeping in mind that nature is a way of awakening generosity, gardening can certainly be an
Yes.
example of that.
That's great. I love that.
Hmm.
I brought in soil and seeds into my recovery group and gave everyone pots, and I had them all plant seeds because I thought I didn't understand what technically I was doing, but I wanted them to care for something outside of themselves.
Right.
And yeah, so it's awakening generosity, which is it's great.
Fantastic. The last thing I want to mention, which I think goes underutilized, it doesn't quite hit the radar as much as I believe it should, is volunteering.
Mm,
Whether
service, yeah.
you volunteer to walk dogs at the local animal shelter, or you push people in their wheelchairs at the hospital, or maybe you go to a recovery center and help out with whatever they might need in terms of extra things that would be meaningful for them. Volunteering is probably one of the greatest antidotes to narcissism because it's such an opportunity to start to see, number one, how we can be of service, but number two, how there's something about giving that comes back, right? It's that cycle of giving that's it feeds the other person, the other organization, but it also feeds us. And that's such a an area that I believe could be used more, actually.
Yeah, it's a beautiful experience. Hmm. How does longing and belonging fit into our conversation today? Longing and belonging.
I came up with the idea of longing and belonging in this chapter because I believe that underneath any kind of narcissism is generally a deeper longing for connection, that maybe it's really deeply rooted and sometimes deeply buried, but that there's a desire to be with others, right? Which is where the belonging comes in. And
Mm.
when I'm talking about belonging, I'm not talking about just fitting in or conformity. I was thinking about this earlier, and as a kid, I grew up in a town where a lot of kids wore the alligator shirts, the
Oh, right.
Lacoste
Yeah, yeah. The
shirts.
preppies.
That was something that people with a little more money than we had would wear, and I really wanted to wear a Lacoste shirt. I actually never did, to tell you the truth. It never happened. And there was sort of a bittersweetness about it because I wanted to be a part of it, but I didn't want to be a part of it. But that was more about trying to fit in, right? Trying to conform. And when I'm talking about longing and belonging, I'm really talking about deeper unmet needs oftentimes, right? There's an expression in the psychoanalytic community, and it goes like this: we're most defended against our greatest needs. We're most defended against our greatest needs. So if we think of that as one of our greatest needs is love, right?
Hmm.
Oftentimes it's hard to receive love. We push back. We don't know how to take it in. It's something that we're protecting ourselves from,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so there's something so poignant about longing and belonging that I believe that when we get closer to others, when we're vulnerable with others, when we take emotional risks with others, when there's a little bit more closeness and intimacy with others, that's really where we're moving in the direction of healing from deeper narcissistic wounds. At the end of each chapter, I really wanted to offer the readers a summary of what they can actually practice, right? So I call the end segment as your practice. And I thought it might be helpful for us to read it out loud. And we're going to alternate today, Sue, if you wouldn't mind starting with number one.
All right. Number one, be aware of narcissistic tendencies in yourself and in others. Observe what's below the surface, possibly deeper longings, fears, and loneliness. Be compassionate for these human parts, which often show up as traits of selfishness, self centeredness, and distancing.
Number two, scratch the surface of compulsive sexual behavior, and you'll find a narcissistic underbelly. It's inside all of us, those in recovery and those not in recovery. Observe your version of narcissism.
Number three, being of service is recommended in all 12 step fellowships because you move from self centeredness to other-centeredness. Getting out of your own head can bring relief and perspective, so track your efforts toward other-centeredness.
Number 4, entitlement can be defined as wanting what you want when you want it. Sounds like a toddler throwing a tantrum, but we all do this at one time or another. Catch your entitlement moments when they happen and investigate how it still functions in your life.
And number 5, narcissistic injury happens when something doesn't go your way and bruises your ego. Injury is inevitable, but repair is where the real work begins. Once you identify the injury, find a confidant to work toward mending this wound.
And number 6, narcissism acts as a wall, a protective way to keep people at a distance. The longer-term healing is to build trust and intimacy safely and gradually. Hold this intention, even if it doesn't feel safe enough today. Thanks for listening today. It was so great sharing the time with my colleague, Sue Merlino, and discussing Chapter 4 of my workbook. If you're so inclined, please give us a 5-star rating and be sure to subscribe and share my podcast with those who may benefit. I look forward to you joining us the next time, and don't forget to stay connected.